Um, Want to introduce Darby Saxbe. She's professor at the University of Southern California. She received her PhD just down the road at UCLA. She's received many awards, including a career award from the National Science Foundation, a Rising Star Award from the Association for Psychological Science, early career awards from both the Society for Research and Child Development and the Society for Personality and Social Psychology. Her general area of research is what probably brought you here today. She explores the biological and social processes that occur in the interpersonal context of a family, especially in the transition to parenthood. And so today we're going to hear specifically about the transition to fatherhood. So join me in welcoming Darby Saxbe.
I have totally lost my voice. I actually am fine. I'm not sick. Don't feel sorry for me. I have just got no voice. So hopefully my slides will do a lot of the work for me. I'm very excited to be here today. I spent a summer in college living in Ann Arbor, working at the University of Michigan. So it's really fun to be back. Okay. You already heard an introduction to me, a little more about what I'm going to do today. I want to tell you why I think the transition to parenthood is interesting, what we know about the hormones and brain correlates of fatherhood. And I'll start with some older studies. I especially want to highlight some work with Robin Edelstein before I get into telling you about some of our lab's newest work. Okay, but I want to start with a clip. This is from the cinematic classic, Paddington. The couple in the film has just headed to the hospital for the birth of their child. And you'll see they go from riding a motorcycle to leaving the hospital in a beige suit. And the narrator says, becoming a father does strange things to a man. So here you go. Looks like the sound isn't working. This is the only sounds.
Father does strange things to a man.
Could you be careful? There's a baby here. Could you step back? There's a baby coming through. Could you keep the flowers away, please? She's too young for pollen.
Where's the bike, darling?
This is our new car.
What?
So this is obviously an extreme example, but certainly the transition to parenthood is a time of change across many domains. And we can think about a neurobiological change. Much of our foundational work in this area is done with animal models, but increasingly with humans, which I'll tell you about more today. Psychosocial change, changes to our relationship, our sense of identity, our social roles, behavioral change to our sleep, our daily routines. And with changes across these domains come risk and vulnerability across areas that we know are important for lifelong health. Allostatic load, our stress response systems, weight changes, mood disorder risk. And when we think about cardiometabolic risk in later life, I think we're often missing a key window in which to intervene, which is the transition to parenthood. And we have this context of public policy and societal support. Certainly in the US, we lack universal paid parental leave. So health disparities may become exacerbated during this time of change and vulnerability. And that includes in fathers as well as in mothers. So we know our brain and body is shaped by our environments and by our social inputs. We think about certain periods of the lifespan as critical windows for plasticity. So that includes early childhood, 0 to 3. There's tremendous rewiring of the brain and body as we sort of get our first social information. But again, in adolescence, the brain kind of reorganizes again. And then I would argue in the transition to parenthood as well. And if you think about just what's happening in the first few minutes after an infant cries, we have to regulate our emotions, problem solve, try to soothe the baby, orient the distress, and even find the interaction rewarding. So what we know so far from mothers is that the cortex appears to lose gray matter volume, which seems bad, but we're learning actually appears to be adaptive. The brain is becoming more efficient and is able to process information more rapidly. And increasingly, we're finding similar changes in men. I think fathers are a really interesting case for understanding plasticity because they don't experience pregnancy directly and they show a really variable range of parental engagement. So we know that hormones can be dynamic across the transition to parenthood, as well as brain and physical health. So I'll tell you about some work looking at testosterone specifically. We know that it's a hormone linked to secondary sex characteristics, mating competition, power, status, and dominance, and that decreases in testosterone are normative in men over the transition to fatherhood. So lower T levels are found in partnered fathers compared to non-fathers. Robin and I collaborated a very long time ago, finding that that fathers who showed decreases in testosterone and greater synchrony with their partners had greater investment in the parenting relationship soon after birth. And I've also found that postpartum testosterone is linked with postpartum depression in men as well as in their partners, but in separate directions. So low testosterone was associated with greater depression in men, but low testosterone was also buffering postpartum depression risk in the partners. So kind of these opposite directions of effects. Like what is good for the goose is not good for the gander. And that this effect was explained in the mothers by their relationship satisfaction. So paternal testosterone also predicted mother's rating of parental aggression and father's rating of parenting stress. So it's been argued that supplementing testosterone in men would help buffer depression risk, but this work suggests that there's this very complex role of testosterone in the family. Can people hear like 40% of what I'm saying? Okay. Yeah, actually, that's a good suggestion. No, to do that. Yeah. Maybe. Yeah. In the Zoom meeting? I don't know if I'm in the Zoom. I think the Zoom is there. Yeah. No, I think Zoom is being hosted here.
Right.
So it may or may not work. Yeah, I'm so sorry. I'm like so hard to understand, even to myself. And I've given this talk before. So that brings me to the work that I've been doing in my lab at USC. We bring couples in when they're expecting their first child. We follow them across the transition to parenthood. And we look at within couple hormonal co-regulation, conflict interaction, couple relationship processes, parent-child bonding and attachment, and then also changes to men's brain. So I'll start by telling you about some of our brain work, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about some of the behavioral work. Okay. Yeah. Right. If you want to understand what I actually, yeah. Okay. Okay, I'm just very like, feel very awkward. I feel like I have like one word per sentence and then the rest is like downhill. Okay, so we pooled our first 20 scans. So we scanned our sample size is about 100 families. We scanned 42 fathers. We were doing follow-up during the COVID pandemic, which required us to halt data collection a little too early. But we pooled our samples with a lab in Spain that has done maternal brain research and found that when we combined this international collaboration, we found that men lost gray matter volume in a very similar pattern to patterns that they had observed in mothers. So the results were more subtle and more variable, but we found also cortical volume loss. And I'll show you, Stephen Colbert reported on the findings. So I'll show you his little joke. Yeah. He's not wrong. It was very difficult for us to keep our postpartum dads from falling asleep. But we found that across the whole cortex, men lost about 1% of their gray matter volume, particularly in midline, mentalizing, social cognition regions. And there were some individual differences. So when men showed larger volume reductions, they also reported stronger bonding with the infant. They spent more time with the infant. And they told us prenatally that they wanted to take more time off of work following the birth. So they were more motivated to engage in caregiving, and they were more hands-on as caregivers. But we also saw some negative consequences. Dads who lost more gray matter volume had worse sleep quality. They reported more mental health problems, and they had more anxiety, more depression, and more overall psychological distress across that first year postpartum. So suggesting that there's really a cost of caregiving for the dads, which really, I think, echoes what we see in new mothers as well, right? Like parenting is wonderful, but it's also labor intensive. It can be isolating, and it can certainly affect our sleep. We did another study looking specifically at hippocampal change. So we know that in animals, the hippocampus remodels and seems to show faster rebound. And that's been found in rodent and primate models. So we found that dads actually had larger hippocampal volumes postpartum when they were more involved in parenting, had stronger bonding and attachment, had lower testosterone, and had higher oxytocin. And that was linked also with lower parenting stress and more effective postpartum parenting. So suggesting that we might have caught our dads in a sort of curvilinear change process. So they were showing some volume recovery in the hippocampus. We also have some functional MRI work. So this is work that was done by my graduate student, Sophia Cardenas, for her dissertation, looking at white matter structural integrity. So she looked specifically at fractional anisotropy, which is like how well a water molecule diffuses through white matter tracts in the brain, which tells us essentially how well those tracts are conveying information. And she found that dads decreased in their white matter structural integrity from before to after birth. And when dads had riskier family environments in their own families of origin, so they were reporting more early family adversity, they had lower structural integrity in their white matter, which in turn predicted less effective postpartum parenting. So the white matter changes were mediating the sort of early risk to postpartum parenting, suggesting you can kind of find this neural marker of parenting risk in the wake of family adversity. So we're doing some more work now. She's actually going to do some more projects looking specifically at sleep and white matter structural integrity. So I will report back. This project was led by my student, Phil Newsome. He was on, unfortunately, a diversity supplement that just got canceled by NIH. I'm very mad about that. But he has still been able to do this project, looking at dads' responses to video clips of their own baby contrasted with an unfamiliar baby, contrasted with their own partner, because we wanted to tease out own versus other baby, as well as the familiarity from own partner, like your partner is a familiar member of your own household. Is there something unique and special about your own baby? So we used multivariate pattern analysis to see if machine learning could tease apart what is unique about the own baby stimulus, and found that particularly in the posterior cortical midline, which is like a social cognition region of the brain that's been linked with fatherhood and other studies, that could sort of differentiate or discriminate own baby stimulus. And that was linked in turn with dad's report of the father-child bond and also with his parenting stress. So dads who showed more of a strong response to own baby had lower parental stress and a stronger bond with their babies. We've also looked at resting state connectivity. So using kind of network centrality, which is a way to look at like the hub of what voxels in the brain are talking the most to other voxels in the brain. We saw that dads had increased connectivity, again, in kind of social cognition regions, and emotion sensing regions when they had a child. So from prenatal to postpartum. And we also found that dad's sense of meaning, so the extent to which he reported that his life made sense, he had a sense of coherence and meaning, that predicted some unique patterns of connectivity, specifically in kind of introceptive awareness regions, including the insula and the temporal pole. So we're really excited about that. Dad's sense of meaning also appeared to buffer parenting stress and negative experiences of parenting. So when dads felt more of a sense of meaning from parenthood, they seemed to not only show this distinct pattern of brain connectivity change, but they also reported kind of a greater sense of finding meaning, or sort of a greater adjustment or adaptation to parenthood. Okay, so we have a couple other projects in the pipeline. One is looking at fathers' processing of emotion using like an emotional faces task across the transition to parenthood. One thing, by the way, that occurs to me is people could go into the Zoom, mute it, and then see the closed captioning if that helps. I don't know. It seems like a weird workaround, but maybe that makes a difference. So we were able essentially from prenatal to postpartum to see different emotion recognition signatures in the brain using, again, NVPA, which is like the machine learning algorithm. You feed it a bunch of information and you see if it can automatically distinguish between different conditions. So it could basically tell prenatal brains apart from postpartum brains just by looking at emotion processing responses to these emotional phases. In another project, this is led by my student Yael, we're looking at how dads respond to images of their partners. So they see video clips of their partners contrasted with an unfamiliar partner. And we're finding that dad's relationship quality is predicting their social cognition activation to the partner, as well as their reward network activation. And that when dads have stronger activation to the partner before birth in these reward and social regions, they're buffered against relationship satisfaction declines. So kind of a hopefully neural signature for greater relationship quality, or sort of less of a decrement in relationship quality across the transition to fatherhood. We also have some behavioral work in progress. This is led by my student, Gabe Leon, looking at couples' behaviors during conflict, finding that when fathers are validating more negative affect, so when their partners voice more sort of negative emotions, if dads are able to validate more effectively, again, the couple is kind of buffered from decreases in relationship quality, sort of suggesting some application for intervention, since we know that transition to parenthood is a high-risk time for relationship quality. Okay, we've also looked specifically at hormonal co-regulation. So the extent to which fathers and mothers are synchronizing in their hormones across this transition to parenthood. So finding, for example, testosterone in our fathers are correlated. So mother and father testosterone are correlated both before and after birth. When dad's testosterone is more synchronized with their partners, men have more of a drop in T after birth, which we think is adaptive for parenting and engagement in parenthood. So there's this sort of within couple hormonal entrainment that seems to be happening that's kind of like pushing men's testosterone change from pre to postpartum, suggesting that proximity to the pregnant partner is an important kind of mechanism for motivating dad's engagement in early parenthood. We also found that couples show positive levels of cortisol. So during relationship conflict, they had cortisol linkage. So they were correlating in their momentary cortisol across a conflict discussion task. And when cortisol levels were linked more strongly, couples behaved more positively towards each other and actually were somewhat protected against postpartum depression. So men who are more synchronized with their partners showed fewer postpartum depression symptoms in the postpartum period. So again, maybe this like adaptive role for co-regulation or attunement between fathers and mothers during pregnancy, which is kind of setting the father up for success after birth. So we've also looked at prolactin, which is a hormone that we know to be associated with, I know Christina works on it in birds and in rodents. It's a hormone that it, like the name would tell us, like it promotes lactation. So it's linked with milk production in moms, but there's also a lot of evidence that it changes in fathers. It's kind of a hormone of paternity. If you add prolactin to water the fish are swimming in, the fish start to act more paternal. So fun manipulation if you want dad like fish. So we found that men's prenatal postpartum levels were not only linked with their partners, but associated with their attachment to the unborn fetus. And then at 3 months postpartum, predicted dad's enjoyment of the infant. So kind of his reward from parenting, more attunement with the infant, and lower parenting stress. And also predicted those kind of dad brain changes of volume loss, specifically in the subcortex, which is where we can find some reward-related regions. So seem to be adaptive for dad's neural remodeling when they had more prolactin before birth. We didn't find any effects for postpartum prolactin, so this was all unique to prenatal, which indicates that there might be interesting timing effects of like when these hormones might matter. Okay. So we've also looked at childbirth, which is one of the most fascinating and weird experiences that new parents ever go through. Birth used to happen mostly at home, and it was, the sort of led by midwives or female relatives. It's really only been in the last 150 years that birth occurs in the hospital with a male physician, and fathers have only been present at childbirth for the last maybe 40 years. So it's a really interesting change in like how we think about men's involvement in early parenthood. And there's almost no research looking at birth as sort of a couple level process or experience. So we found that we gave partners a prenatal couple conflict task. So when they had more negative conflict before birth, they actually reported more difficult and stressful childbirth experiences. We asked them within about 24 to 48 hours of the birth. So having like a more disagreeable relationship with your spouse actually is setting you up for a more challenging and complex birth. So they actually not only subjectively reported more difficult birth, they actually had, according to birth charts, more medically risky births. So more interventions, lower APGAR scores. So the way the couples interact might really tell us something about the quality of the birth experience in a way that can have impact on babies' early outcomes. My student Lizzie also found that when dads said that childbirth was more stressful for them, they had more postpartum depression 6 months after birth. And that was even after controlling for prenatal depression. So it seemed like something about the birth experience was kind of getting under dad's skin to sort of influence their mental health, even a long way after birth. And we also controlled for C-section versus vaginal birth. But dads who really had a harder time during the child's birth were then struggling more with parenthood. Again, suggesting, it behooves us to think about this as a couple level process when we're thinking about risk factors for fathers as well as mothers. Another student, Jeff Corner, looked at how couples made meaning of the birth experience and found that when their birth stories included more meaning making, like making sense out of a difficult experience, trying to find reasons, kind of post-traumatic growth, that they subsequently had fewer declines in relationship satisfaction and had lower parenting stress. Again, there's that role for meaning in kind of helping dads adjust to new parenthood. Okay, so what else? We've also looked at how couples talk about and divide infant care. So we had couples do like a who does what in the lab, like who's gonna wake up with baby, who's gonna change the baby, who's gonna take baby to the doctor, both before and after birth. And Lizzie again analyzed these data, found that both mothers and fathers predicted a more egalitarian division of labor than they ultimately achieved. So mom was doing more sort of no matter what the couple predicted. Dads especially thought that they were going to do more, and especially, even after birth, felt that they were doing more. But when dads in these narratives used more we pronouns, so we did like linguistic inquiry and word count to see pronoun use patterns. When they used we, like we're gonna do this, we're gonna do that, and they ended up contributing more to infant care, they actually were happier in their relationships after birth. So it actually seemed adaptive for the dads to be more involved, which I think is helpful to know for intervention. It's not just that you're happier when you get to take a break from early parenthood. It's the dads that were really present and really thought of early parenthood as something that they were doing too, who ended up kind of being happier with their partners and in their relationships. So we can, I think incorporate that into how we talk about new parents. How do we talk to couples? This is another study. We looked at whether dads had access to paid paternity leave. And I mentioned like the policy landscape can really drive a lot of health disparity. Lower income parents are more at risk because they just don't get the same amount of time off to recover and bond after birth. And I think we don't appreciate that enough when we think about policy. So in California, you can get some state-funded disability leave for dads. So we were able to look at that in our dads. About half of our dads got some paid leave, and about half of our dads didn't. And we found that, because dads who have access to paid leave really aren't equivalent to dads who don't, we didn't want to just look kind of like between. So we looked at within person, within couple, changes in well-being, and found that when dads had access to paid leave, they showed kind of better trajectories of stress and depression. Their partners were actually buffered from depressive symptoms. So we know maternal postpartum depression is really costly societally. And so it may be that paternity leave is one policy intervention that can actually move the needle on mother's well-being after birth. So when we think about it as like a healthcare expense, it may be cost effective. Dads also had fewer sleep problems when they had more time off, paid time off after birth. So I hope you are convinced, if you are not already, that the transition to parenthood is both sort of psychosocially and also neuroendocrinologically transformative for men as well as for women. And that, men's kind of biology seems to link up with their parenting motivations and behaviors. So I think the next step question is, so what? How does that inform early child development? And do fathers exert kind of unique additive or compensatory influences on child well-being, which I know Brenda has worked on quite a bit, that arena. So this is from a theoretical model from a child development perspectives paper that my student, Sophie Cardenas, first authored. So we're kind of testing that model now. So we're bringing our couples back into the lab to do follow-up. We're having them do some family discussions, interactions. They do an Etch-a-Sketch task. They build a tower together out of magnet tiles. They talk about how the kid is doing at school, COVID impacts. We're doing another Who Does What to kind of look at division of labor 7 years later. And then we're doing the NIH toolbox, which is like a neurocognitive developmental battery to look at the kid's attention, sort of cognitive skills. And then we're scanning the dads, and we're also scanning the kids. So hopefully we will be able to look at not just men's brain change across the transition to parenthood, but really look at the longitudinal sequelae for the kids and see if we can see differences in brain structure or brain function in kids maybe who have less exposure to prenatal stress from both mom and from dad, because we can kind of look at them together in the same model since we have reports from both mom and dad. We also have a sample of families that we recruited early in the pandemic. I think I have a slide about that. Let's see. Yeah. So the main study is called Hatch. This is CHIRP, coronavirus, health, isolation, recovery. Because obviously I can't stop with the acronyms. Our lab is the NEST lab, neuroendocrinology of social ties. So we did an online remote survey in the first month or so of the pandemic. So in April 2020, we sent it to basically anyone, convenient sample, people that were willing to participate, expectant parents, mostly moms, like 90% moms, but some dads as well. And we wanted to see how, being pregnant and transitioning to parenthood during the pandemic changes some of the same measures that we've been looking at in Hatch. So mental health, parent-child bonding, parental relationship quality, all of those same kinds of measures. So we've been following this sample. We have prenatal 3 months, 6 months, 12 months. We did a 2-year follow-up, 3-year follow-up. And then I'm hoping if people still give grants, we'll see, or maybe I'll just pay for it out of my startup, which I've been hoarding. We'll do like a 7-year to match the Hatch 7. And then we can really compare across the samples. So let's see. Okay, so here's my critical window joke, because the window is very critical. Do we think of the transition to parenthood as this window when health trajectories and health disparities are accentuated or inflected? We already know, or hopefully now that the brain is changing, hormones are changing, our sort of different adult health outcomes are changing. We often think about, the developmental psychology of infancy and early childhood, but I really think there's a developmental psychology of parenthood, and the birth of a child is also really the birth of parents who are navigating this new set of demands, roles, and responsibilities. That can be really transformative, I think, in a lot of both good ways and bad ways. And there's some new evidence, not from my lab, but from other labs, that actually becoming a parent is neuroprotective in late life. So people who have more children actually have younger looking brains in sort of older adulthood. So even though my lab is sort of reporting on some bad things, I think maybe there's a reward, kind of at the end, later in the lifespan. We also know that people with grandchildren are really happy. So much happier than people with children. So it's sort of, it catches up. Okay. So this is my first book. This is my first attempt to put a QR code into a slide. But it's coming out in June. And this is like a popular press book talking about a lot of this work, but also talking about just fatherhood in general. Can anyone tell me, is the QR code working? Okay, great, because this is an experiment. So I interviewed a lot of dads, and it's got a lot of like stories of, men who became parents during incarceration, uh, in the wake of loss, as step parents, as adoptive parents. So just a lot of like different examples of how variable the fatherhood transition can be. And I really think that's like the kind of maybe overall take home is just that fathers vary, and they vary in really interesting ways. And I think there's a lot of value in studying that, kind of using multi-method inquiry to see, how the brain, biology, psychosocial relationships are changing kind of during this really pivotal time, both for families and for children. So it brings me to the end. And I'm happy to answer questions. If I can say any more words, I will try. I'm just happy I survived. Oh my gosh. Yeah, not to be repeated. Hopefully this is my first and last talk with no voice.
Thank you so much. You did great. And I'm so excited about your book. I know like 40 people I want to give that to. So,
Well, please do.
um, thinking about your work on hormonal synchrony, do you or others find reductions in gray matter happens at similar rates between both parents as they have a kid? And is that adaptive or maladaptive? And what do you
Yeah.
think about that?
Yeah, so a lot of the work that has been done in moms was done in Spain. And then also there's a study in the Netherlands finding really widespread gray matter volume reductions across the entire brain, cortical, subcortical. So like cortical is kind of the outer layer of brain tissue that does our like, I guess you could call it like the monkey brain. Subcortical is like, you could call it like the lizard brain or the rat brain. So kind of like our more primordial, I don't know, I have an animal researcher here, so like, I know that's really reductionist. Kind of like our more primordial emotion drives. So moms changed dramatically in both. Our dads' changes were way smaller, more subtle, more variable, and specific to the cortex, which is that, again, like outer layer of, kind of more recently evolved executive functioning, reasoning, social cognition, which I think is really interesting. If you think about like women who at least are biological mothers are really rewired by pregnancy hormones. Whereas the men, their experience of parenthood is coming online specifically through experience. So we're getting experience dependent change, which I think is, just giving us like, I don't know why this disappeared, a somewhat different neural signature. So I think there's a lot more to do. One thing I would love to do is try to see whether father and mother brain changes are synchronized. We don't have mother brain in my lab. I don't know if any of you have heard about Emily Jacobs, who's at UCSB. She does super intensive, like hundreds of scans within an individual. And she has moms, and she also has their partners. So I'm really itching to like convince her to collaborate with me and see whether we can see any kind of like synchrony.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for such an interesting talk. Really appreciate it. So I'm thinking about the role of culture and how family structures and even the division of labor, right, among parents might differ across cultures, and specifically thinking about how you guys are located in LA, which is very demographically diverse, and thinking about like how you guys have a very large Hispanic population,
Yeah.
where oftentimes, you know, family structure is like many other people involved in addition to the parents, right? Maybe grandparents or cousins, etc. So I'm curious how you think that those kind of broader family structures influence the processes that you're talking about.
Yeah, it's a really great question because Brenda and I were talking about this. Like, humans really evolved to do cooperative care, right? Like alloparental care. We're not supposed to do this in isolated nuclear families. So understanding like extended family and community relationships is really important. So in our lab, we did have a pretty diverse sample, but it wasn't a big enough sample to really look at cross-cultural differences. So, like I think of it as like it's a first pass on a lot of these basic questions. And we really need like bigger studies, multi-site studies to really look like across countries and cultures. But we know like social support really matters. We know and there's been lots of work on social support and postpartum depression in moms. We know that moms that get more support end up, looking better after birth. So I think the role of the father is really interesting because, like, in a lot of cultures, dads don't do that much because mom and like grandma and cousins and siblings are really involved. And, there are some hunter-gatherer models where dads are super involved. And I interviewed someone for my book who studies like the most involved fathers in the world in the Congo. Their dads are within arm's reach of a baby 50% of the time. But you don't need dads as much when you have a whole intergenerational extended caregiving network. So in some ways, contemporary cultures, we're actually much more reliant on dads to sort of do like a lot of the heavy lifting of parenthood, which is just a really interesting question about contemporary fatherhood. Even just like who's present at birth, right? Like maybe dad, but not grandma. Yeah. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. That was so interesting. So I have two quick questions. So first, do you find that these effects at all differ by age of a first-time father? And then second, I'm curious about your synchrony findings and what you think that that might mean psychologically. Like what exactly is spurring that? Do you think that people are more synchronized because they're spending more time together, that they're reacting to conflict similarly, or maybe that they're like attuned to their partner's emotions? I guess I'm just curious what you think is underlying that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like the $1 million question. Like, what drives synchrony? I think it's like proximity, shared sleeping environment, probably shared daily routines, like social zeitgebers, like daily rhythms. But who knows, like pheromones, shared saliva, right? Like shared meals. There's a lot that we need to figure out to kind of know like what those mechanisms are. And I think like a way to test it would be look at dads who are separated from their partners for fixed periods of time and see if you can detect like shifts in synchrony, for example, during pregnancy or postpartum. So someone should do that study. And in terms of age, we have mostly just controlled for it because our sample isn't really big enough. And we have a pretty narrow range. Most of our dads, like these are all cohabiting couples where the dad is planning to live with the partner after birth. So they're mostly in their 30s, but maybe Luke and Chris, we can look at this in your like, young adults and see like if there's variability. Like I think like adolescent dads and young dads is a really interesting question. We know the brain is remodeling during adolescence. So like what happens if you're a teenage parent? Do you remodel in two different directions at once? Or do they cancel each other out? Like we just don't know.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
Hi, I'm not sure how much this is connected to your research personally, but I am curious, how much does the father's involvement affect a child's attachment style compared to the mother's involvement?
Yeah. So someone who's looked at that is Pascal Vertica, who's at the University of Essex. He finds that kids can pretty much attach totally equally to moms or to dads. So there's really no like difference where it's a more secure attachment to one parent versus another. There's some work on the idea of not just the attachment relationship, but it's like a theory called the activation relationship, which, and Brenda, maybe you know about, like when kids are sort of like getting stimulated, engaged in active play. And it seems like dads might play a unique role in that relationship, but moms can also contribute. So I think it's so variable depending on the family constellation and also just like the individual child. So I write I have like a Substack newsletter, and today I wrote one about do dads invest more in sons versus daughters? And the answer is it depends. Like it's variable. It depends on culture, context. So, yeah.
Darby, thanks for the talk. It's been
Yeah.
great. So I have sort of like a broader question is, and I don't know if in your studies, if you have a group, a pre-post group that are not parents, or if people have done this. One of my questions is like, how much do you think this is specific to fatherhood versus like if we did pre-post on somebody who went through like a big stressor or a
Yeah.
big sleep deprivation, how much do you think, like how much are you confident of the findings are fatherhood with
Yeah.
the baby versus any of the other things?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I wish we had enough grant funding to have a control sample. We haven't been able to. But the group in Spain that looked at mothers did have a control group of women followed across the same time period who didn't become parents, and found that these changes were really unique to mothers. And in our collaboration with them, we compared our dads. They had a very small control group. It was like N equals 17 of men who did not become fathers. And so we found changes kind of over and above the comparison sample. That said, that tells us just men hanging out for 9 months. It doesn't tell us about a big stressor. So we're looking more at the role of sleep. Like we do have a lot of measures of sleep. And I think that's a really interesting mechanism for a lot of these changes. So I guess the question is like, what would be the analog? Like what's similar to parenting? Like, I mean, certainly you can think of stressors, but becoming a parent is also like really rewarding. So it's this very unique transition. So if you have good suggestions, let me know.
then you're sleep deprived.
Yeah.
There's probably something like that. I was thinking maybe an astronaut. I don't know, something like that.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I agree. I think that's why I think when you're talking about fathers, it's super interesting, right? Because the mothers, like, we're not surprised because they've been pregnant. I mean, obviously you could look at mothers who didn't give birth but are moms, but it's interesting because it is like more like an exogenous change. And so that's why I was thinking also my experience of having had young kids, like that there's just a lot of shifts, some of which are like baby related, some of which are going to happen if you have a baby, but could occur, I guess, elsewhere, although you're right, probably not commonly to most people.
And that's one reason we've been leaning on individual differences in parent-child bonding or just like time with infants. So if we can correlate the brain changes to those, then we also feel a little bit more confident that this really is reflecting dad's involvement in parenthood. And it does seem like with the dads, you don't actually get huge changes across the whole sample. What you get is a lot of variability that's tied to dad's like time and investment and involvement. So I think that also sort of like reinforces my confidence that this is somewhat unique to parenthood. But I think like I like the astronaut idea. Like my dream is to find like a publicly available data set of similarly aged men without children followed across at least 2 time points where there's some kind of stressor. So anyone that knows of one. Yeah. But who scanned those? We need to scan, but we need people that have scanned them. Because I don't know if I'm gonna ever do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Darby. This is great, and I've been following your work for many, many, many years. I guess one of the things, I mean, I've become very interested lately because of my own work on fathers, same-sex dads.
Yeah.
So you're taking birth completely out of the picture, and you're looking at 2 men who have made the decision to raise a baby together. They've also have to go through a huge, the surrogacy. They'd have to try to find a surrogate. They actually, oftentimes do attend the birth. What do you think about that? I mean, do you think the same type of stuff is going on there with respect to synchrony and brain development, but you got 2 dads now going on, making this transition? I mean, I would love somebody to do that work. But,
yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, your guess is as good as mine. Like Ruth Feldman did look at male couples that had a baby and found that there was a distinction between primary and secondary caregiver dads. And the primary caregiver dads looked a little more like the moms in terms of but that was functional data, like responses to infants. But in terms of just like structural change, I mean, the fact that the primary caregiver dads looked more like the moms tells me that you might see similar brain change even in the absence of pregnancy. But because it tells us that men are really plastic. But I don't know. I would love to know. Yeah, please.
Okay. I have a couple questions and some feedback. You mentioned in your talk that I think in the hospital, like that a patient, a woman giving birth could be affected by having a male or female physician. I have 2 children, so I had 2 different female physicians, and I had a supportive husband during that process. But I just was curious if, like, have you seen differences between the male and female physician? One of the physicians I had was a physician, but she was focused, like her kind of approach was like a midwife. And in my particular situation, she mentioned it was so important to have that degree because I had an emergency situation, and she was trained in that particular, like the child had a cord wrapped around her neck. And so, so midwives are trained differently than physicians in that regard.
So in our studies, we didn't look at whether they had a man or woman, supervising the birth. But I think one reason I was interested in that, the male physician sort of entering the birth suite, the birth experience, is just that in and of itself is a big historical change. Because all physicians were male, in the almost all, in the early days of medicine. And so you went from a midwife who is pretty much always female, to, all of a sudden, a doctor who is almost always male. I just think that's a huge cultural change that totally affects women's experience. And, birth from the 20s to the 50s was hugely medicalized, like super powerful twilight sleep anesthesia that just knocked women out completely. They had no memory of the birth, which actually isn't good. They had no pain, but also no memory. And you wonder, why the baby boomers are so weird, right?
Yeah.
That you have all these generations of kids born with this really important part of, the parental bond, just looking totally different. So now we think about the first 24 hours after birth is this kind of magic bonding time. Not for everyone, but certainly I think we've really changed our understanding of childbirth.
Yeah. I think in one situation, I was given too much epidural. In another situation, my second child, she didn't want to be born. She just wanted to stay in her current home.
Yeah.
And they wanted to induce her, even though it was happening naturally. And I think it's changed, the environment's changed because hospitals have a certain, business protocol of getting people in and out.
Yeah.
I assume, given the book you wrote, have you read the Female Brain book?
Yes.
Okay, because I was reading that. I had it for a long time, but I hadn't had a chance to read it. So that definitely has an impact too in terms of, and I think it's something that people don't understand, but there's differences between male and female brains. And I would be interested to understand, during pregnancy versus not as well. So.
Yeah, I think it's one of the many areas where we need a lot more research. Yeah.
Well, thank you for your time.
Yeah.
Any other questions? In the front, okay.
I was wondering, would you see the same effect with uncles, grandfathers?
Yeah. Great question.
Yeah, so I was an uncle 10 times before I became a father myself, and now I'm a grandfather several times. I'm wondering if I have any gray matter left.
It's all gone. Yeah. So I did talk about, in the book, I did a little research on grandfather brain. And James Rilling, who's done some work on the maternal brain, actually has one study where he looked at grandmother's brain changes and found similar changes in women becoming grandmothers to women becoming mothers. But I asked him, do you think we would see much with grandfathers? And he said, maybe not, because the evolutionary role of grandfathers is different. Men can technically still become fathers, later in life. Whereas grandmothers are really, they're sort of shifting. People think like part of the reason for menopause is so that, we have this period where women aren't having their own children, but they're still healthy enough to be involved in caregiving, because that helps the survival of their grandchildren. So I don't know, but there's no studies looking at it. I do think like with your uncle experience, like there's a role of just like baby care experience, because a lot of men now becoming parents have never held a baby or really interacted with a baby who isn't, their own baby is the first child that they're holding. So it's a much more like 0 to 60. And I think that's unfortunate because we expect a lot from dads, but they don't necessarily have a lot of scaffolding.
Call it a day and thank Darby Saxbe for a wonderful talk.